closed captioning for the professors is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury and wrongful death law firm in Chicago.
They have been called lazy, retweeting, narcissistic, Facebook-liking, tech-centric brats, better known as the Millennials. So how do teachers get the attention of these tech-savvy young people in the classroom? That's coming up next on today's edition of The Professors. Joining us to talk about teaching the Millennials are Daryl Reynolds, professor at Trinity International University, Michael Crenshaw, professor at Daly College, Khalil Murar, professor at Governor State University, and Dr. Nick Panamitros, attorney and professor at Kennedy King College. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The me generation, the Millennials. Now, people have been talking about this issue for, for quite some time. You've heard a lot about this in the news.
Sure.
We find that young people today have a lot of, I think, negative perceptions that come from older generations. So people assume that young people today are not as engaged in conversation with people. They assume they're not as interested. Studies have shown in politics and civic engagement, studies have shown that political engagement, voting, participation in civic organizations is down. And also, even today's generation, I mean, they even watch, oddly enough, TV less than older generations because everything that they deal with is social media based mobile apps they deal with a lot. So the question is, and we could go a lot of places with this conversation today, so this is going to be a fun one, I think. But the question is, what do you all think about the trends in young people today? And how do you deal with that as someone who works with young people in an academic setting?
Well, I think you have to be really, really engaging. You know, as a teacher, you cannot be what I like to call a sage on the stage. Mm-hmm. So in other words, you can't just stand in front of your students and just talk at them for an hour and a half. Because the moment you start talking at them for an hour and a half, then they're going to turn into narcissists. They're going to pull out their phone. Mm-hmm. They're going to start texting. They're going to be on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Vine, all of those things. Mm-hmm. So as a teacher, you have to make sure that you're engaging with them. And one of the things that I try to do is I try to make sure that they're always in groups. Mm-hmm. They're always talking to each other. And I always make sure that they're always engaging with each other to the point where that phone does not become a distraction.
Okay. All right. Okay. Interesting. How about you guys? How do you all deal with this perception of a sort of a shorter attention span among students today?
It seems as though in the classroom especially, they have so much emphasis on the self and this thing about duty, mm-hmm. whether it's to do your homework or to partake in civic obligations. It seems as though the self and self-esteem has become more self than self-esteem, and it's a generation that seems to be very spoiled.
Interesting. Okay.
And I see one thing happening phenomenal-wise is that it seems the last generation had a duty to their children, had a duty to to the social environment, and it seems as though this generation has taken that duty given by the last generation, says I'm not going to do it anymore, and it's like a super spoiled generation.
Well, let me throw out a couple of pieces of data, if you will, around this issue. So we know for a fact that marriage rates are down significantly among this generation. Right. We know that people live together more often. If they do get married, they get married later. And even childbearing years are on the rise as well. In Europe, it's known as a demographic winter in terms of population actually declining as a result of this. There was a study done by a Notre Dame sociologist that I think is very interesting. It said that they interviewed 18 through 23-year-olds around the issue of morality. And when they were asked to describe a moral dilemma that they faced, 2/3 of young people couldn't answer the question or describe problems that were not moral at all, like whether they could afford rent at a certain apartment or whether they had enough quarters to feed the meter for their parking spots. So now, obviously that's funny, that's comical, but it does speak to a generational shift that I've got some thoughts on, but I want to hear yours first. So,
well, I think it's been really a critical shift from the last generation to this one. The moral structure, if you look back to the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s and the kind of the abandonment of traditional values. What started with the baby boomers and then moving away from some of that structure and those original values now has been firmly implanted in the millennial generation, where they feel as if those kind of values and structure and those issues are optional for them. The idea of getting married to one person and staying married for the rest of your life is a bit of a foreign concept, and if it's something they choose to do, they can, but there's nothing that's pushing them toward that kind of outcome. So moral, ethical structure has become something that people choose to do rather than it being an imperative that they feel like they have to do.
Sure.
So we've lost a lot of those things that really were the underpinning, the values that were underpinning the nation. It'll be curious to see as the millennials grow up and become parents themselves, what kind of children they raise.
Okay, but some people say, and the argument on the other side is that this sense of moral relativism that young people have today is a good thing. It makes them more open-minded. It makes them more willing to accept people from different backgrounds. A lot of people argue that. They also argue, and here's the flip side as well. So my work in politics, I did talk about the voting rates down, but what's not down is actually volunteerism, which I find to be interesting. So young people are engaged in different ways in the political process. So they're not engaged in traditional ways, traditional organizations, but they may be more engaged in sort of volunteering at a local community organization, et cetera. So is it all doom and gloom? Is the question.
It's not. And I was, you know, as I hear this, as I heard adults like us talking about, you know, the decline of society.
Now, I got to tell you just quickly,
Yeah.
you know, 35 is the cutoff.
Yeah.
Group, and I'm 36. I'm 37 next week.
I'm
so
34.
Okay.
That means you're
so,
in it.
so I, you know,
I don't mind.
I'm an adult, but just
and some of us do clip that the millennial generation, whether you're 35 or 36, you know. So I think the rumors of society's decline are greatly sort of exaggerated, and the reason that I say that is because, you know, every elderly generation across time and space, from the ancient Greeks onward, have bemoaned the relative decline of the young people. You know, and the truth is, you know, all of us were young once. I mean, we all remember a time in which, you know, people that are older than us sort of begrudged us the kind of, you know, moral relativism and inactivity and idleness, frankly, that we suffer from. And if you look at, you know, as a social scientist, you know, we look at why it is that things happen. So why is it that young people do not participate in voting? And very often we find out that there are very real, tangible reasons for that. And it's not just, you know, in young people's heads. I mean, the truth is, the political system has shown young people that your participation does not mean as much as other people might have taught you. You know, going to church does not mean as much as other people taught you. I think a lot of times young people feel this ennui, this sense of restlessness.
But Khalil, is that true though? Because I would argue that both church attendance and political involvement mean just as much now as they meant 40 years ago.
And in some instances, more so.
Of course they do, and actually I think we need them much more so, especially with you know, the social fabric sort of coming apart and at the seams. But at the same time, I think that we need to sort of renew the direction that we have as a society. I mean, I think a lot of us sort of, you know, have lost a certain social element of ourselves being in the United States of America. I mean, you know, Robert Putnam wrote this book called Bowling Alone, where, you know, there's been this decline of people partaking in civic activities across the board. And I think that young people are just basically showing us that that's what's going on. Maybe much more so because of Twitter and Facebook and really the notion that somebody can be connected without ever talking to anybody at all. I mean, you can sit at your home and get on your Facebook and really never see anybody at all, and yet you're still partaking in society.
That's pretty fascinating if you think about it.
And really, people are less happy now than ever before. I mean, there have been studies that basically suggest that people that are on Facebook, that there's a correlation between the more you're on Facebook, the less happy you are, which is really striking.
Very interesting.
So real human interaction is actually important.
You hear that, Nick? Because Nick just updated his Facebook status just now.
It's tweeting as we talk.
Okay.
Right now.
It means you're
Well,
not
Khalil
happy.
alluded to, he said that since the ancient Greeks, and if you read the Ethics or the Politics by Aristotle, these arguments come up in those works. And the situation is that this generation, in terms of education, has more education than probably any generation in the past. And with the ability to critically think, it's the same arguments that come up in those texts. If you read those books, there is the question: does my vote count or not? What am I doing? Why am I partaking? What for? And so, in the past, that wasn't the case. The big people, the representatives, would make the policy decisions for the population, and they would pretty much just follow.
So you're suggesting that our young people's ability to critically think and to really question, if you will, their participation in, say, politics, et cetera, is actually having a negative impact on their civic engagement, is what you're saying.
Absolutely. And if you read Aristotle, he says he has different things, like a person should not be in politics until after the age of, say, 40, 45. And he says a person should not study philosophy before the age of 20 or 25, because you find a reason not to go to school, not to do anything. You philosophize, and at the end, you don't do anything. And so I think that's part of the issue here.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to critical thinking, I mean, we have to keep in mind that a lot of students don't know how to critically think. So in my classes, I'm really a huge proponent of critical thinking and making my students do that. First day of class, second day of class, I asked them to define critical thinking. They're looking at me like I'm crazy. What is that? How do I do that? Because again, going back to the sage on the stage, students are robots. They come into class, they have their sheets of paper, they have their pen. Think about it. They sit down and they're sitting just like this, and they're ready to write. And so the minute we get into role playing, if we're reading Shakespeare or something like that, and I ask them, okay, Hamlet was going to do this in Act 3, Scene 2. If you were Hamlet, what would you have done? And they have this blank look on their face. So when we get to that part of critical thinking, we need to make sure that these students know how to critically think and they understand the definition of critical thinking.
I really think that there's an illusion that comes with access to knowledge. The internet gives you access to knowledge, and from that you can presume that you actually know a lot of things. What it really does, it is, because you have access to information that you can move from one spot to another without really engaging in it. So critical thinking actually starts to take a real slide, rather than you you taking the information, engaging with it, spinning it with another group of people from different aspects of it, and then learning from that. A lot of that comes from simply taking information from the internet and moving it into whatever situation.
See, I actually would have to disagree with you guys. I think within the classroom context, yes, there is probably a lack of critical thinking. I would fully agree with that. But I think outside of the classroom context, I think our students critically think all the time.
Absolutely.
I find that especially that questioning that you're talking about, why should I do this? I've got a 7-year-old daughter who literally this morning decided that she was going to just throw a tantrum with me, and I asked her to do something, she didn't want to do it. She didn't understand why she had to do it. And so, I kind of wrestled between the old school and the new school, right? So I started getting old school, like the old school folks, and I ran up to her and I said, honey, work with me. But it really, I wrestle with that as a parent. How much do I allow her to have that level of critical thinking and to be able to engage for herself? And how much do I put down the hammer and give her rules? And what I do find among our young people today is that they are more willing to step back and question the status quo, which I think is a very, very good thing.
That is healthy. But if they're simply questioning the status quo to question it in order for their own benefit, let me question this because I'm trying to find a way to resist it, because I really don't want to engage. I don't want to be a part. I'd rather stay in my Facebook world rather than find some other way of getting out. And if I can question my way out of it or resist it long enough, then I don't have to engage. There's a big difference in that situation.
But whose fault is that? One thing that I do find to be very interesting about this is that oftentimes, and I've seen this a lot of times, older people will say, boy, look at these kids today. And then what I say to a lot of them? I said, well, who raised them?
Right.
Right? So if you look at, okay, for instance, in
question.
1960, okay, so in 1960, they did a survey of college freshmen. They asked them what the '1 reason they were going to school was. In 1960, the #1 reason college freshmen said they were going to school was they wanted to gain a better philosophy by which to live.
Okay.
In 1990, they did the exact same survey, and the #1 reason, anybody want to guess what that was?
Job.
It was job
money,
and
money.
specifically money, right? They wanted money.
Exactly.
But here's the interesting thing. That, you know, the 80s generation was a very, very capitalistic, sort of self-consumed generation.
Sure was.
The 90s. So when we look at this, in a lot of ways, these kids are really just responding to what they've seen.
I agree with that.
You know?
And they're reflecting, you know, society. I mean, they're a
Value,
reflection of the values of society. So, I mean, if there's something rotten in Denmark, to go back to an old Shakespeare adage, right, it might just be that it is a reflection of our society. And you know, a lot of these young people, I mean, you know, we talk about them being me oriented. In the region that I study oftentimes in the Middle East, that me orientation is actually good because people do not want to suffer the ways of the elderly who basically, you know, rule with an iron fist. You know? I mean, it used to be that you have these authoritarian dictators that get away with a lot more because people did not have a sense of self-worth.
Very important.
They saw themselves as part of a society, and sometimes, you know, maybe it's a good thing to question, you know, society, your parents, authority. You know, we wouldn't have a Steve Jobs if it hadn't been for a me kind of mind, right?
Sure.
But we have to be careful, though. I mean, there are limits, right? So that, you know, just as the individual has to think of herself, she also has to think about her society. And I think where we can sort of, you know, distinguish that line is really what we should be grappling with as people who are, you know, members, leaders of society.
Because to your point, the Arab Spring is a perfect example of that, right? That's the good side. But then the downside is there was a study that was just done recently among the millennial generation, and they scored lower on empathy tests.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So what you see is, so on the one hand, we are, you know, there's some good positive stuff that's happening here. On the other hand, they're more likely to see people suffer and not really engage or really care because there's a disconnection, especially because they see it so much through the media. You know?
Let's step back for just a second and talk about some of the positives that the generation does bring with them. They are very hardworking.
Yes.
Their ability to engage technologically will.
You think they're hardworking?
Yeah, they actually are.
Okay. They have to be.
They
They have
actually
to
are.
be.
If you look at them in a business perspective, when they go to work, they actually, if they're in a job that they care about and are concerned, they actually work very hard at that.
Because I mean, I don't want to sound like this old dude saying this, but like
You are.
Okay, I'm like a year and a half out of this thing. Okay? Don't do me, all right? Now, my dad worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and wanted me to go in the car business like he did, and I didn't really want to do that. So the point is, when you say that, I'm even speaking from my own personal perspective. I'm like, man, I don't think that I'm as hardworking as my dad was.
Well, I'm not using it comparatively because
Okay.
they have different tools and they have
In that way.
access to
Maybe
they
different
have
ways,
access
It's
to
a different paradigm.
It is. It absolutely
what's
is a
the issue.
different-
There's been a paradigm shift. Go ahead.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
So there are some real benefits. They're very creative. They tend to do things where the motivation isn't just money. Money is part of what they're seeking, but they do have an underpinning that says that the issues that they're engaged with, they really care about and they're passionate about. Okay. So there are some real positives that they bring. The issue that we were talking about is around how they've been raised. And the parents of the millennials, actually, I think they called them helicopter parents in one of the studies, where they just hover over and they made sure nothing was ever wrong, nothing was ever uncomfortable. And I think that we are actually reaping the whirlwind as a result of that, because we told them that everything was about them, and now they're acting that way.
Ah, very good point.
And this generation is also very active in partaking. Past generations, because of less schooling, had to basically had to have trust in their trustee, you know, in politics or whatever it may have been, the particular issue. But this generation is able to, you know, critically think. And although we see in the classroom we have issues, out in the street, I agree with you, Ted, that they are able to do it well. And so they're able to do many things on their own. And I think that caters to the individualism that Anglo-American culture has brought since World War II.
Very important point. And I would argue, back to the teaching field, that, you know, there is some fear among those in academia that we're not going to have jobs in 30 years
Right.
because of this notion of self-teaching.
Right. I mean, you have online,
Right.
schooling and things of that nature, to where now, why do I have to go to a traditional classroom? All I have to do is sit at home, and I can be in front of a computer. And depending upon the college or the university, I can have a bachelor's degree in 20 months or something like that. So why should I have to be in a classroom, which lends to that me generation? And it kind of goes back to communication, because my big thing with the me generation is the lack of communication, the lack of speaking. Is very difficult, and I always take it back to the classroom. For me, I can only speak from my experience. Sometimes it's very, very difficult, other than those 5 students who sit in the front, to get all of them to actually talk to each other and communicate. You ask them a simple question, do they respond? So, and 9 times out of 10, they're really not responding. So yes, outside of the classroom, they may be really, really good when it comes to critical thinking in terms of music or clothes or something like that. But then when you ask them something tangible in the classroom, all of a sudden we shut down, we put our heads down, we pull out the cell phone, we go to Facebook, and then this it gets funny this way. Then they'll post a question online on Facebook or tweet it out and have other people talk about it, but then they're still not answering the question. See, so there's my issue.
I think one thing, I know we don't have that much time, but one thing that's sort of being omitted here is responsibility and duty. That they're critical thinkers, but that A and B working together, A, the critical thinking part, but B, the duty or responsibility, it seems as though they don't have a sense of duty, or they feel that they don't need to have a sense of duty.
That's a very important point, Nick. As you were talking, I was thinking about the sense of nationalism that you see in many other nations. The nationalism that is in America is a nationalism that's connected with individuality. So we're nationalistic about our freedoms, not necessarily the nation, right? And so you see the Chinese, they have a larger, the Japanese, a larger sense of duty, connected to nationalism. We don't. But I would argue that that is sort of embedded in the American story, if you will. So, I mean, we're, as you said, we're sort of reaping what we've sown over generations. And as you see, as we go further, because the ultimate American identity is around freedom and individuality. So they're living that out. I have another quick story. I got a lot of family stories, and I want to turn over in a second. But we were at a family event last week, and my aunt was, my aunt grew up on the south side of Chicago. Her and her husband, not very wealthy. They worked very hard. Their kids now, all 3 of them have lived overseas and have gone travel. I mean, they've gotten all kinds of degrees. And you know what she says to them? She says, why don't you, now we get controversial here, okay? Why don't you marry somebody from the community? Why don't you go back and live in the community? And they said they didn't want to. And she got mad at them. And I said, why would you get mad at them? And I told her, I said, why'd you get mad? You did that to them, right? And that happens in Hispanic communities, in Indian communities. I mean, you name it, all across the board. I've seen it all these different ways, that this generation that gets this stuff, then they get mad when their offspring are not community focused. And that's really what we've built, I think, in this country.
Well, it's going to be harder and harder. And I partially agree with what she was saying. It is important to be able to replenish the communities that we're coming out of. However, the more of the world you see, and the more global, both socially and economically, we become, it is then easier to step out of a culture or community that you've been used to into one that you're completely that's completely foreign to.
And I don't want to feed the narcissistic beast, but look, I mean, these millennials that we're talking about here so glibly, I mean, these are people that have had it really hard. I mean, they really have, right? I mean, 2006, 2007, were the bubble times and the good times and lavish credit, and you had the ability to be a sort of a helicopter parent because it was a time of plenty and abundance, right?
Yes.
These kids, and I don't want to call them kids because it's insulting, right? But these young individuals that are coming out with a college degree nowadays, if they have the fortune of graduating, are having a really hard time finding a job. I mean, it is a fact that 1 in 2 college students that we have graduated from anywhere across the USA does not have a job, right? And it is a fact that these people, the millennials, the me generation, whatever you want to call them, have had to forcefully adapt to the conditions that we have witnessed. I mean, let's not forget that we just underwent one of the greatest recessions that we've ever seen since the Great Depression. And they really have had to fend for themselves, where we sort of, failed them in that respect. And having a continuation of plenty a lot of those people now, you know, find that they have to, you know, that they can't even go to college, or that,
Yeah.
you know, that you can't have, you know, your own room, or that you have to share this and that, and that you have to do without, you know.
Well, what I would argue, even beyond that, Khalil,
Yeah.
and I agree with you that they have had it hard, but I would argue that not economically as much, but even socially and morally.
Absolutely.
Because they have lived in a territory they've had to navigate and figure out moral law for themselves. 70% of African American children grow up in single parent homes, 40% of all children grow up in single parent homes today. Are the culture of capitalism and sexual promiscuity, et cetera, has really shifted, and they've been in the middle of it. So in a lot of ways, they're really kind of trying to figure this stuff out. And so yes, they've had challenges economically, but I think they've had a landscape that has been less defined morally. And I think that is a disservice that I think this generation has done.
It is a
for
disservice.
I think
that
you're
generation.
absolutely right.
Yeah.
What we haven't really taken enough time to discuss as a country is the whole issue around fatherlessness and what the implications are as a result of that. We are looking at this first generation where divorce is more commonplace than couples that stay together. Multiple marriages, children out of wedlock. Those were issues that previous generations dealt with on a smaller scale, but now it's much more common than what used to be the traditional situations. So the results, what are the implications? What are the results of fatherlessness? And I think that fathers play a particular role in raising their children that helps to bring about some of the things that the millennials are struggling with around being able to commit long-term to something. The whole idea of sacrifice, we've lost that as a nation. A couple generations ago, that was clearly understood. But
Daryl, I got to stop you. You know, that's one of my favorite topics too, by the way, but we are out of time. But maybe we'll do our next show on that.
Maybe.
Because to your point, it is super important that we recognize what the previous generation's decisions have done to this generation. And I think they don't have to take all the blame by themselves. And so there have been changes, but I think there's enough blame to go around.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Thank you guys for coming today. It's been a good conversation.
Thank you.
That's our show for today. The conversation continues online at wycc.org. We'll see you next time on The Professors.